So Apple has caved and decided to remove its advanced data protection tool instead of giving the government backdoor access to encrypted data. Not that they really could have done in the first place because of how that encryption works. More about that in a minute. But this to me shows that it really is becoming a police state here in the UK. Now, many of you might otherwise call me a conspiracy theorist, unless it was absolutely verifiably true, for reasons I'll explain in this video in my opinions. Now, we're here on Secrets because lots of you have emailed me about this. It's all over the news, and it is quite frankly ridiculous. It is really making everybody's security weaker in the interests of national security, and that is really very much the definition of a police state. So welcome back to Secrets. Do subscribe if you haven't already. You get my sometimes unvetted, unedited views on here, so I will go on a bit of a ramble sometimes, but here we go. But also on the subject of weakening the UK, there's also discussions about whether we should imprison sex offenders just because they might suffer PTSD if they're sent to prison. And we're not allowed to deport people because of their human rights aspects and things like that. I might touch on one or two of those later in the video, but stick around for one or two of those. And Rupert Lowe is looking for statistics on such things, so more about that in a minute. Very interesting letter he sent. But first, this Apple thing. Now, as I said, my views here. My view is this, that there are two camps of people here, really. There are people that say, well, I don't care, they can look at my stuff as much as they like, there's nothing to hide, etc. And that is precisely the point, because for the vast majority of people, there is nothing to hide. The vast majority of us are not criminals, we're not terrorists, we don't have anything to hide, and most people that get caught up in this sort of stuff do so accidentally, because they send a photograph that is completely benign and innocent, but actually gets flagged for some reason by technology, and then they get roped in and questioned by police or authorities. One such example was a chap had a highly detailed photograph of his son, use your imagination, that he sent to a doctor because he was concerned about something. That got flagged and he's got his whole account closed down. And then he got questioned by police or the FBI or whoever it was. And so he got questioned over that because of this highly detailed photograph. But obviously there was a good reason for sending the photograph to the doctor, because he was concerned about what he sent. And I think that is just an example of how this stuff can be misused and how it can go wrong. Now, what the MPs behind all of this, and I'll come back to the request and stuff in a minute, but what the MPs behind this don't realise is that if they use iPhones and iPads and MacBooks and whatever, and they use iCloud and their data is stored in iCloud, they will be vulnerable to this too, because let's get on to a bit of the security about it. So the advanced data protection tool means that it is end-to-end encrypted data. So imagine that there's a key over here and a lock over here, which is essentially just a long string of numbers, and they pair up. Unless you have that key, you cannot access the encrypted data. So it's encrypted, so it's absolutely jumbled up through a complicated algorithm, and even if you had the data, even if these hackers or whoever, even if they had access to the data, it's encrypted so they can't read it, unless they have the key, which is on your phone, your device, your iPad, iPhone, or whatever. Now, if you don't have that key, you can't access the data. What the government reportedly, because they wouldn't confirm or deny it, they said we don't comment on such things, but reportedly what they said was to Apple, give us a backdoor access to this encrypted data. Now, there's no real obvious way of saying that they could give them a backdoor access, because they don't really have, by definition of this, they don't have access to that. Only the person whose data it is and has the key on their device can access the encrypted data. That's the point. Now, giving a backdoor access would only mean that they've created some other less secure way of accessing the data, which then means that malicious actors and hackers and whomever would be able to access that as well if they had nefarious intent. And that entirely contradicts the point of security. And on the subject of data protection and security and your personal data, very fitting for one of my partners for this video. Don't go away. As a content creator, at least once a week, I get somebody trying to imitate me, literally copy me. They steal my face profile photo. They steal my bio sometimes, they try to make a username that looks like mine, then they steal my videos, or they comment to you in the comment section trying to make you think that they are me, and they try to enlist you in some kind of scam or something or other. And it's really frustrating. And I have to deal with that on a weekly basis, and so that's something that you don't often see. But the other thing you don't often see is when we get clients come to us who have literally had their identity stolen, and they've had fraudsters taking out loans in their name. Mobile phone contracts are a big one because they order phones and they get the phone with it, and obviously they have no intention of paying it back. They just leave my client with the problem of sorting it all out, and the thief then goes off with the phone and sells it. And all of this happens because these fraudsters get hold of just enough of their information to be able to impersonate them. Personal identity theft is a massive problem, and that is why I consistently talk about it on this channel, and it is why that I quite sincerely and genuinely partner with Incogni to help to prevent you from falling victim to identity theft. So if you haven't signed up with Incogni just yet, you might want to think of doing so, because what Incogni does is contacts all of the data brokers and marketing companies that put together your information and they sell it onto third parties. You might remember that little wording at the bottom, we may share your information and data with third parties. What they don't often tell you is that they might sell it to third parties, and so you are literally up for sale. There was an interesting advert or something or other I saw just the other day where it was like an auction room and they were auctioning this lady's information, and that is literally what they are doing. But what Incogni does is they contact all of these data brokers and marketers. They use UK law and US law, and they insist and require that they remove your data from their servers so they can no longer sell you on again and again. Because what happens is once they've sold your information enough times, it will inevitably end up in the hands of fraudsters who then try to impersonate you and steal your identity. Then they take out loans in your name, and then you end up going to a lawyer to try to sort it out. Worse still, you end up on the fraud database and you just won't get a bank account after that. They'll close you down. They'll close all your accounts, all your credit cards, mobile phones, anything that's got any form of credit attached to it, they'll close it down. And of course, as a partner to my channel here, I get you a fantastic discount, which is 60% off using the code BlackBeltSecrets, the name of my channel. I'll put the link and the code in the description below. Of course, you get a 30-day money-back guarantee if you change your mind, but once you see on the dashboard the amount of companies that are removing your data from their servers, it will be staggering, and you'll be so pleased that you signed up. I've had genuinely lots of emails from you guys that have been so relieved at these companies removing your data. So check out the discount. It's 60% with the code BlackBeltSecrets and the link in the description below. And not only will you receive fewer spam and junk messages and phone calls, but it will seriously reduce your financial risk of having your identity stolen. So check out the discount. The links are below, and thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. The whole point of security here is that your data is secure so that people cannot access it, so that it's encrypted, so that even if they have access, physical access to the data, they can't see it. It's a bit like your MacBook when it says, would you like to encrypt your hard drive? And you say, well, yeah. And you put in a long password. So unless you put that password in, even if you lose or you have stolen your laptop and someone has access to it, physical access to the hard drive, they've got access to the data. Unless they have your password, they cannot read the data because it's encrypted. And so unless it goes through that decryption process, they cannot read the data. But these MPs have obviously not realized that their own data may be at risk for that because of this pressure on Apple. Now, I called it. I'm going to find my video here because it's exactly what I said would happen. Let me try and mute my mic. There we go. I found the mute button. I'm going to mute my microphone, play this video for you, put it on screen. This is where I called it. Just 1 second. Let me move it down so you can see it. People. So I can see a huge problem with this. I can see Apple refusing to comply, tying them up in legal knots, or just withdrawing the service altogether, and then recording people. And that was it. So tying them up in legal knots, yes, I think that's going on in the background. I think Apple will be challenging this legally, but that will probably take years. And in the meantime, the government will say you have to comply in the meantime. And so my prediction there, if you missed it, Apple will just withdraw the service completely. And sure enough, it's reported in the BBC here. This is what you now find. If you already had it turned on, it will remain turned on for now, I think. And they say that existing users' access to it will be disabled at a later date. But if you haven't turned it on already, you can no longer turn it on. So it says Apple can no longer offer advanced data protection in the UK to new users. So it's possible that this is an interim compliance. Apple has said, right, well, we're not going to give you a backdoor, but we're just going to turn it off for now. So we can't give you access to that now. because we've not made it available. As for the existing users, they might say, well, it's going to take us time to deactivate it, but we're going to do that. And they'll possibly risk this clash, this legal clash with the government. They'll probably say, well, it's worth the risk to not compromise our security. Because they shouldn't compromise security. No one should compromise security. Now, coming back to a point, I said there was two camps. There was two camps of people. One who say, well, I've nothing to hide, etc. And I gave you an example of the problem with that, because you can get caught up in all sorts of legal jeopardy. Even if you have nothing to hide, you think you have nothing to hide, there could be things on there that people say, well, you shouldn't have this on there, and therefore, we're going to prosecute you for it or whatever. The other camp of people, I think I fall into that camp of people, is where you say, well, actually, no, there should be a proper, robust legal process if you want access to my data, but otherwise my data should remain secure. Because whilst I've nothing to hide, we have the right to privacy. That is a protected right. We have the right to a private family life. And that includes all your data and your photos and your messages and your documents and all of that sort of stuff stored. Now, somebody made an interesting point on an X thread. Would you just allow a whole bunch of police officers who you don't know, any number of police officers into your house, rooting through your drawers, through your bank statements, your private documents, your photo collections, or your private collections or whatever, just to have a look to see if there's anything there? Now, this does bring us onto a legal point, which I'll probably cover more on my main channel video, is that they will still need the legal mechanisms to get access to any of that data. It isn't just an open door now. They still need a warrant to look at that data. And as I mentioned in my previous video, I'll link below, you can watch it for the requirements they have to go through. They still have to comply with all the requirements for a warrant to access that data. So it is not just an open door, but they have forced a lower level of security in the UK. And for me, lowering the level of security in the interests of national security is a bit of a police state. I think that's wrong. I don't think that's acceptable. I think at least one of the MPs is probably going to end up in some kind of difficulty because of all this at some point, and then realise actually this is not such a good idea. That's usually the way these things happen. Some people asked, is this open to challenge? Well, yeah, potentially it is, because there's a right to privacy. Is this an overreach? Is this a step too far? Well, the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, which it is understood that this has been issued under, is a legal framework that allows the UK government to issue a technical capability notice, which they will not confirm or deny, on such companies like Apple, to require them to have certain capabilities and access to their technology. So you remember the whole argument about WhatsApp messages, because they are also end-to-end encrypted. Again, remember, end-to-end encrypted means only you and the end person can access the data. And in terms of your data, you and the data can access the data. No one in between, because it's encrypted. So even if they intercept it in between, it's encrypted, so they can't. So you remember the argument about WhatsApp messages, etc. And the same thing, they were requiring, they would have required WhatsApp to scan all the messages before they were encrypted and essentially spy on you. So again, police state. I think this very much screams police state to me. So this is how they can issue such notices. So that would be the legal battle going on if they challenge that in court. And as I say, my personal view, I think it's wrong. I think by all means, go after the terrorists, go after the criminals, etc. But this is also a double-edged sword. My opinion extends to this. It's also a double-edged sword. The fact that this is secure, flip this around a minute. On the one hand, you've got them trying to look into people's data because they suspect that they are criminals, and they want to break down criminal networks exploiting children and things like that. But let's look at this in the reverse. If you want to protect children, then their data needs to be protected and therefore needs to be encrypted. And so this is a double-edged sword. If they remove that level of protection by going after the criminals, they remove the level of protection for the children involved. If they have their data, and before some of you scream that children shouldn't have these things, well, parents have their children's photographs on their iCloud storage, surely. And so that data would be secured, but for removing this layer of protection. So if they want to protect children, obviously, by removing that layer of protection, the 99% of us who are not criminals I paraphrase, but the 99% of us who are not criminals have that level of security removed and therefore are at risk. So now to other forms of security, which Rupert Lowe is looking into. He's written to the Minister for Border Security and Asylum asking to reveal the statistics on how many deportations that have failed due to the influence of ECHR. That is, human rights-based arguments that mean we should not deport criminals. So taking a look here, Rupert Lowe has penned this letter to the Minister. Let's take a look at this. There's been a significant level of media coverage recently on the number of failed deportations thanks to the influence of ECHR. The Home Office has previously stated that to publish the actual number and detail of these failures would be of disproportionate cost, which I don't agree with, by the way. I think those statistics are readily available on a system somewhere. It would take someone all of 15 minutes probably to pull that data together, and if they can't do that, then they're not keeping it properly, and they should be keeping it properly. Remember, data should be kept securely, safely, etc., and it should be accessible to them, so they should be able to pull this data together relatively quickly. He goes on, your department has a responsibility to be open and transparent with the taxpayer, and considering the many millions we are spending on a daily basis housing illegal migrants in hotel accommodation, any administrative costs of putting this vital information together will be entirely proportionate. I hope you'll reconsider and not leave it to intrepid journalists to uncover this important information. The British people deserve to see just how much their hospitality and generosity has been industrially abused, all enabled by the influence of a malign foreign organisation. And he's talking, of course, about the influence of ECHR, because the arguments that people cannot be deported because of their human rights claims, for example, they've joined a group, therefore they're at risk, or their sexuality or the way they identify puts them at risk, or in that other case where the child didn't like chicken nuggets outside, therefore it was unfair to the child, and that then had to go to an upper tribunal to overturn to say that was not a valid reason not to deport the guy. So that's been now remitted back for another decision. All of these things arguably weakening the UK, from data to deportations, even to imprisoning people. I put a poll out on my channel here. Should the ECHR be used as an excuse for sex offenders to avoid jail if they've previously been tortured in prison? Now, goes without saying, being tortured in any prison anywhere is wrong. That shouldn't happen, and we should have sympathy for those, even if they are criminals and whatever. However, that probably shouldn't extend to, well, you don't need to go to prison then because that might cause you PTSD. So I put this out as a poll, just genuinely to see what people think, because, just because that's my view doesn't mean it's everyone else's view. But it turns out it pretty much is. Out of 30,000 people, only 1%, and obviously that 1%, this doesn't do fractions of a percent, that might be one person, it could be one or a few people, but 1% say, yes, it's unfair to send him to jail. Now, I don't know how they justify that. Just because he's been tortured in prison previously doesn't mean that if they go off and commit all sorts of offences that they should get a free pass. How can that possibly be argued? I really don't understand that. My personal opinion, obviously. And don't confuse this with what advocates do in court, obviously. If you are instructed as an advocate, as a barrister, to go and represent somebody, you make the argument fearlessly. What you can't do is put forward an argument that is unarguable. This, and I stressed in my previous video not to criticise the barrister or even the judge for considering the decision, because the barrister is obliged to make that argument, because it is a valid argument. Not that it's an argument that you should agree with, but it's a valid argument to make and a valid argument that the judge should consider and rule on. Now, it may well be that the judge says, no, that's nonsense, but the judge must rule on it. That's a very distinct difference there. A lot of people ask me why I said don't criticise the barrister and don't criticise the judge. That's why, because the barrister's got a job to do, the judge has got a job to do, and if the judge just dismissed it out of hand without considering it, it's a perfect point of appeal. Because then, certainly if I were the barrister there, fighting for this guy, you understand, I would then say, well, because the judge didn't consider it, didn't give it proper attention, that needs to go to the Court of Appeal, because the judge should have considered it, or possibly judicial review, because a judicial review is where they consider something they shouldn't have considered, or didn't consider something they should have considered, and it's a public law decision, etc. So that would be a perfect route of appeal if that wasn't considered. So the judge has to consider it, and the barrister can put forward a valid argument. Not that you have to agree with it. And as it turns out, 30,000 people voted on this, and 99%, I think in my original video I said, I suspect that over 90% of you will say, no, send him to prison. And I was right. 99% of 30,000 people said, send him to prison. Obviously, this is not a scientific poll, but it is a very, very straightforward, this is what people think kind of poll. I think you have to be logged in to vote on these polls. Let me know in the comments. But this, all of which I had to comment on it, and oddly enough, I'm doing my views first here on Secrets. Please do subscribe for my views here. A lot of you interested in my personal views. These are just my personal views. I think this is government overreach. I think this is the government not protecting the people of the UK in the interests of national security, going after those that they want to prosecute. I think it's all a bit bizarre. Very similar arguments might be made about Tommy Robinson. I'll deal with that in another video. Lots of arguments about that. I don't know everything about that. The reporting is... I've read some reports this morning that seem quite detailed, but other than that, it's a bit sketchy. So I don't really know what's going on there, if I'm being completely honest, because ordinarily, if you're kept in isolation, you should have the choice whether you're in isolation or not, to an extent that there might be a duty for them to keep you safe, but they have to balance that with your mental health being in isolation. So more about that in another video. Please do subscribe for that. But as always, thank you for watching, and I'll probably cover this again on my main channel. Jump over there for that as well. I might look into a bit more of the detail there. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.